Hello, dear Insomniacs. Come in. The fire's been going a while now, so the chair nearest it will already be warm, and I've saved it for you. Set down whatever you carried in with you tonight. It doesn't need holding for the next little while. Nothing here does. I found something on the shelves this evening, tucked behind the atlases where it had no business being. A small book, soft-bound, thin enough to hold in one hand. No label on the spine. The pages had gone the colour of weak tea at the edges, and someone, long before my time I think, had pressed a small blue wildflower flat between two of them. And it's still there, and I've left it exactly where it was. It's a gentle one. Settle in, and I hope you enjoy it. The Little Lantern Keeper. Long ago, nestled between rolling green hills and a sparkling silver river, there was a tiny village where every evening, just before the stars appeared, warm golden lanterns would light the winding streets. They hung from iron hooks on the corners of houses. They swung gently from the low branch of the old oak at the crossroads. There was one at each end of the little stone bridge, and one outside the bakery, and one at the very top of the hill, where the road stopped, pretending it was going anywhere in particular, and simply looked out over everything below. The villagers loved their lanterns. They said they made everyone feel safe and welcome and at home. And they said it so often and for so many years that after a while, nobody thought to wonder whether it was true. It simply was. The way the river ran west, and the bread came out of the oven at 4, and the cats claimed the warm windowsills before anybody else could think about sitting there. The person who cared for every lantern was known as the Lantern Keeper. It was not a grand job. Nobody wrote songs about it. But it was the sort of job that everybody noticed at once if it stopped being done. And that, if you think about it, is a very particular kind of important. The lantern keeper of that time was an old man with slow hands and a soft, unbothered way of walking, as though he had never once in his life been late for anything and did not intend to start. He had kept the lanterns for longer than most of the village had been alive. He knew which ones sputtered in a north wind and which ones needed their glass wiped twice. He knew that the lantern by the bakery burned a fraction brighter than the others, and he had never worked out why, and had decided some decades ago that he didn't need to. But one spring, the lantern keeper grew old. Properly old, the kind that settles into the knees, and he decided it was time to rest. The village worried about it for a whole fortnight. Who would climb the ladders? Who would know about the north wind? And then, to everyone's surprise, the new lantern keeper wasn't a grown-up at all. It was a little girl named Sophie. Sophie was small enough that some of the lanterns hung higher than her head, and a good few of them hung higher than her head and the ladder put together, which she solved by climbing to the second highest rung and stretching, with her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth in concentration, the way you do when you are quite determined and quite small at the same time. She had bright, curious eyes and rosy cheeks, and a little satchel that went everywhere with her. Inside it, a tin of matches, 3 polishing cloths in 3 different states of grubbiness, a spare wick or 2, and a row of tiny bottles of glowing lantern oil that clinked softly against one another as she walked, so that you always heard Sophie coming a moment before you saw her. The old keeper gave her the satchel himself on the last evening, at the bottom of the hill. "They'll go out sometimes," he said. "That isn't a failure. That's only weather." Sophie nodded very seriously, the way children do when they've been handed something heavier than it looks. And they know it. And they mean to carry it anyway. So, Sophie began. Every evening, just as the sky turned soft shades of pink and lavender, she would set out from her front step and begin her walk. She carefully climbed the little wooden ladders, one rung at a time, never hurrying, because the old keeper had told her that hurrying up a ladder is how you end up at the bottom of one. She polished each glass until it sparkled, twice, on the ones that needed it, and she learned quickly enough which those were. She filled them with fresh oil, holding her breath as she poured, because the bottles were small and her hands were smaller. And then, one by one, she lit each tiny flame. The first would catch and glow and settle. And Sophie would climb back down and stand and look at it a moment before moving on. Not because she needed to, just because she liked to. As each lantern glowed to life, the village became warmer. Children laughed on their way home, kicking stones ahead of them down the lane. Cats stretched luxuriously on cozy windowsills and blinked at nothing in particular. The smell of fresh bread drifted out of the bakery door and hung about the street corner like it had nowhere better to be. And everyone smiled when they saw Sophie passing by. "Thank you, lantern keeper," they would say. Sophie always smiled back, and it always took her a half-second longer than you'd expect, because she always meant it. "Sweet dreams," she'd reply. The lanterns taught her things, slowly, over that first year, the way any work does if you pay it enough attention. She learned that the lantern by the bridge liked to be lit last, because the mist came up off the water and put it out if you did it too early. She learned that the one at the crossroads under the old oak went out at least once a month for no reason anybody could name, and that this was simply the oak's business and not hers. She learned that if she left the bakery lantern until the loaves came out, Mrs. Aldworth would be at the door with a heel of bread still too hot to hold properly, and would press it into Sophie's hands and refuse to hear a word about it. She learned that old Tom, who lived alone at the far end of the lane and hadn't much to say to anyone, always happened to be standing at his gate at exactly the hour she came past, every evening, in every weather. It took Sophie nearly a year to understand that he wasn't standing there by accident. After that, she always stopped at his gate, only for a minute or two, only to say that the wind had turned, or that the bread had been good today, or that she'd seen a heron down at the river and thought he'd like to know. And old Tom would nod and say, "Ah," and look pleased about the heron in a way he'd never have admitted to. She began lighting his lantern last of all the ones on the lane, so the minute or two could stretch, without either of them having to say that's what it was for. Then, one evening, dark clouds covered the sky. Sophie felt it before she saw it, that heavy, waiting stillness that comes just before weather arrives properly. The birds had gone quiet. The river had that flat metal look it gets. A chilly wind rushed through the village, turning up the leaves of the old oak, and rain began to fall. Not gently, not the soft kind that taps at a window and makes a room feel cozier for it. This was the other sort, the sort that comes down in sheets and finds every gap in every coat and doesn't care whose evening it's spoiling. One by one, the lanterns flickered. Sophie stood in the middle of the lane and watched them. The one by the bakery guttered and steadied and guttered again. Then pop, pop, pop. They went out, all of them. Up the lane and down it, along the bridge, out to the crossroads, all the way to the top of the hill. The streets became dark and quiet, properly dark, in the way a street only can be, when it's spent every evening of its life being lit. People peeked nervously through their windows. Somewhere, a door was pulled shut, a dog barked once, and thought better of it. Sophie stood there in the rain with the water running off the end of her nose, and her satchel getting heavier by the second, and every single lantern in the village dark around her. She was very small in that moment. She knew it too. She pulled her little hood up over her head. She took a deep breath, and then she whispered, to nobody, or possibly to herself, or possibly to the old keeper. It's okay. One lantern at a time. She lifted her own little lantern, the one she carried on her belt, and held it close to her chest with both hands, and she began to walk. The bakery first. It was nearest. Her fingers were cold and clumsy, and the first match wouldn't catch at all, nor the second. She turned her back to the wind and made a cave of her shoulders and tried a third time, and this time the flame took and wavered and held. One. The glass fogged, then cleared. Warm light spilled out across the wet cobbles, and the puddles caught it and threw it back doubled. And suddenly, the bakery doorway was a place again instead of a shape in the dark. Sophie let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Then, the old oak tree at the crossroads. She climbed the ladder slowly, very slowly because the rungs were slick, and she got that one lit on the first try, which felt, just then, like the greatest achievement of her entire life. 2. Then, the lantern near the bridge, where the mist came up. Then, both the ones along the bridge itself, the second of which fought her for a good 3 minutes, and then gave in all at once the way stubborn things do. With every tiny flame that returned, the darkness seemed a little smaller, a little warmer, a little kinder. And somewhere around the 5th or 6th lantern, Sophie noticed that she wasn't walking alone anymore. She hadn't heard them come out, but there they were. Mrs. Aldworth from the bakery, with a shawl over her head, holding the ladder steady with both hands. 2 of the older children, running ahead to wipe the glass dry before Sophie even got there. And old Tom, who had come all the way down the lane in the rain, and who said nothing at all, and simply held the matches under his coat where they'd stay dry, and passed her a fresh one every time she put out her hand. Nobody made a speech about it. They just went along with her, up the lane, in the rain, one lantern at a time. As Sophie reached the very last lantern, the one at the top of the hill, where the road stops pretending, something wonderful happened. The rain slowed. Then it stopped, in that sudden, surprised way rain sometimes does, as though it had only just remembered somewhere else it needed to be. The clouds drifted apart, not all at once, slowly, the way curtains open, and above her, thousands of stars twinkled into the night sky. Sophie stood at the top of the hill with the wick still smoking between her fingers, and she turned around, and she looked back down at the village. Every lantern was lit, every single one, all the way down the winding street, all the way along the bridge, all the way to the crossroads and the old oak, a long curving line of small gold lights laid out below her in the dark, like something spilled and left there on purpose. And above it, the stars, thousands of them, doing very much the same thing. It looked, for all the world, as though the stars themselves had been waiting for the village to shine again first, as though they'd been up there the whole time, behind the cloud, being patient. Sophie smiled. "Good evening," she whispered to them. The stars seemed to sparkle back, which they may or may not have done. It was a very wet evening, and she was very tired, and she never claimed otherwise afterwards. Behind her, at the bottom of the hill, the villagers stood in their doorways in the new gold light and looked up. From that night on, the villagers realized something important. The lanterns didn't only brighten the streets, they reminded everyone that even the smallest light can make a big difference, especially when somebody shares it with kindness. And there was something else, though it took them longer to put words to it. It wasn't really that the lanterns went out that night. Lanterns go out. That's only weather. It was that a very small girl had gone out into the rain to light them again anyway, and that once she had, nobody in the whole village had been willing to let her do it alone. The seasons turned the way they do, quietly, so you hardly noticed them going. Sophie grew a little taller. Not so much that the ladders became unnecessary. She was still very glad of them, and still climbed each one the way the old keeper had taught her, one rung at a time. But she never hurried her evening walk. Not once. She still polished every lantern with care, twice on the ones that needed it. She still lit the bridge last, on account of the mist. She still stopped at old Tom's gate for a minute or two to tell him about the heron, and she still wished everyone the same thing every evening in the same soft voice. Sweet dreams. Sometimes children would walk beside her, carrying tiny lanterns of their own, little ones made for small hands that gave out barely enough light to see your own feet by. They loved hearing her stories about the moon and the stars and sleepy birds and the fireflies that danced over the river on warm nights and seemed to have no idea they were doing anything remarkable. And sometimes, if the evening was quiet and the walk was long, one of the children would ask her the question. They always asked it eventually. "Weren't you frightened?" That night in the rain, when they all went out? And Sophie would think about it properly, because she never gave a child a lazy answer. "Yes," she'd say, terribly, and then she'd smile. But it turns out you can be frightened and still light the next one. Those two things go together far better than you'd think. Then she would crouch down to the child's height, so they were eye to eye, and she'd tap the little lantern in their hands. "A lantern isn't just for lighting a path," she'd tell them. "It's also for reminding someone that they're never alone." The children remembered those words, every one of them. They carried them the way you carry something given to you by somebody who meant it, and they shared that kindness onward in small ways, without making a fuss of it, with a neighbour, with a stranger, with anyone standing out in the rain who looked as though they could use a little light. So the village became brighter, not because there were more lanterns, but because there were more caring hearts. And every evening, as the sky turned lavender and the first stars peeked out, tiny golden lights shimmered all through the village. The lanterns glowed, the stars twinkled, the river sparkled softly, and Sophie, The little lantern keeper stood at the top of the hill with her satchel over her shoulder and watched her peaceful village settle down for the night, because she knew that every warm light and every gentle smile and every small act of kindness helped make the world feel just a little more like home. And under the quiet blanket of stars, the whole village drifted into the sweetest dreams. That's where the book ends. I'd have liked another page or two, but I don't suppose I get a say in it. I've put it back on the shelf without a label, which is where things like that belong. You'll find it again, if you ever want it. The little blue flower is still pressed inside right where somebody left it. The fire's low now, and that's all right. It doesn't need much from me at this hour. Neither do you, I think. Sleep well, dear Insomniac. I'll leave the lamp lit, the way I always do. It holds steady. It's been waiting on purpose. Good night.